Hello and welcome. In today's video I'm going to discuss the Kuril Islands dispute, a border dispute between Russia and Japan, and possibly one of the best known territorial disputes in the world. And when a settlement is likely to be reached, or if a settlement is ever reached, I can see that I can see newspapers claiming World War II has finally come to an end. As far as World War II is concerned, or was concerned, it definitely came to an end in 1945, and neither side is likely to attack the other. At least that's how it seems at present. Nonetheless, in both Japan and Russia, this is a major political issue, and in both countries because nationalism makes it so. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to discuss the historical reasons for the dispute and to see if we can draw any conclusions from it. I wrote this originally in 2018, and it's because it takes me a long time to actually put something up. And the situation since then has changed quite dramatically, and so this may affect the conclusions. Now, originally I wanted to show you a map, but you'll have to have a look at it on an atlas or something, but I'll try and explain things as best I can. The Kuril Islands are a volcanic archipelago of 56 islands and many rocks that stretches around 1,300 kilometers northeast from the Japanese island of Hokkaido to Kamchatka, which is today part of Russia. In geographical terms, they separate the Sea of Okhotsk from the North Pacific Ocean. The total land area is 10,503 square kilometers, and there are today 20,000 people approximately living there. In fact, there's probably a bit less than that there. And most of the population are from settlers from the former territories of the Soviet Union. The native Ainu people make up a very small minority. In the mid-19th century, Russian and Japanese settlers came to this region, and as a result of this there was a need to define the borders, and in 1855 the Treaty of Shimoda was signed. This came shortly after the Japanese treaty with the United States, which ended Japanese isolation. The treaty had a number of points dealing with trade, shipwrecks, opening of consuls on the border between the two countries, which placed the border between the islands of Etorufu and Orub. Now, we have maps which make this quite clear. You can find old maps, as I did and what I wanted to show you originally, and where Orub is clearly Russian, and whereas those the southwest of Orub are Japanese. At the same time, the island of Sakhalin was not to be partitioned, but it was to remain under a joint Russian-Japanese control. However, the joint control of Sakhalin didn't really work. It was ineffective, so in 1875 a new treaty was drawn up. This was the Treaty of Saint Petersburg, in which Japan renounced all claims to Sakhalin in exchange for Russia giving up claims to Kuril Islands in favor of Japan. Now, one might argue that Russia got the best of this. Japan got a string of volcanic islands which didn't have much in economic benefit or potential in exchange for giving up claims to an island which had a landmass around 7 times bigger. Despite that, we now have the first problem. The original treaty was drawn up in French, which was the international language of diplomacy at the time, and a language which in Russia, if somebody was literate, which very few people were, but they probably also knew French, and indeed they would probably know French with native speaker competency. And with that in mind, I would suggest you have a look at the early versions of War and Peace, where large parts of it are in French, in the Russian language version. I did this as a student studying linguistics in the 1980s. So if you had a look at that, the original that was done in the 19th century, you can see lots of it in French. By the time it was reprinted in 1961, there was much less in French. There was probably reprints in the time getting rid of French gradually as people became literate in the Soviet Union. Now, the Japanese delegation wouldn't have had the same ability, and there seems to have been a mistake in the translation, and this fails to define the extent of the Kuril Islands. Now, unfortunately, I can't throw any more light on this because whereas I can read French and I can read Russian, I can't read Japanese. So therefore, I'd refer anybody interested to the work of Thierry Moorman, which is called Le Problème des Kurils pour un retour à Saint Petersburg. The Russo-Japanese War from 1904 to 1905 was a major Russian defeat. The Treaty of Portsmouth brought the war to an end, and amongst other concessions on the Asian continent, Japan received the southern half of Sakhalin Island. Once more, it was as though Japan didn't want the island. It had occupied the whole island in the period leading up to the peace negotiations, and at Portsmouth, had demanded Russia pay reparations for the war. Russia refused and said it would continue fighting, proposing Sakhalin instead, and following US intervention in the negotiations, Japan ended up with the southern part of the island and no financial compensation. So I would suggest that Russia got the best of that deal. There were further clashes between Japan and the Soviet Union in 1938-39. I say clashes because this is the word which is normally used. But I would suggest to you that as there were some 50,000 casualties, these weren't clashes, more of an all-out war. However, after the Soviet Union allied itself with Hitler in the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a deal with Japan was on the cards, and this was signed in Moscow on the 13th of April 1941. The terms of the treaty allowed for peace between the two countries, and if one should be attacked by a third power, then there would be strict neutrality by the other. In 1943, the Cairo Declaration said that Japan would be expelled from all other territories which had been taken by violence and greed. Of course, by this time, the situation had changed. December 1941, attack on Pearl Harbor, Japanese expansion in the first half of 1942, then gradual push back as it retreated in itself. And by the time of the Cairo Declaration, it was quite clear that Japan was going to lose. 2 years after the Cairo Declaration, we got the fall of Nazi Germany. The Allies issued the Potsdam Declaration, which stated that the Japanese sovereignty over the islands should be limited. The Japanese sovereignty should be limited to the islands of Honshu, Hokkaido, Kyushu, Shikoku, and such minor islands as we determine. That's a direct quote. Such minor islands as we determine. In February 1945, Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill met at Yalta and decided that the USSR would enter the war against Japan within 3 months of the Nazi German surrender, that the territorial concessions of the Treaty of Portsmouth in 1904 would be reversed, and that the Kuril Islands should be handed over to the Soviet Union. However, the Soviet Union had a treaty with Japan. The treaty between the Soviet Union and Japan was valid for 5 years. That is to say, until the 13th of April 1946, unless repudiated at least 1 year in advance. That's to say, until the 13th of April 1945. And the Soviets kept this part of the treaty. They did repudiate it on time, within the timescale, and it was as it was legally permitted to do, but then it broke the treaty. On the 7th of August 1945, Molotov gave the Japanese ambassador 1 hour's warning that the Soviet Union would attack Japan. On the 14th of August 1945, Japan accepted the Potsdam Declaration and on the following day announced unconditional capitulation. On the 18th of August 1945, the invasion of the Kuril Islands commenced, and by the 3rd of September, it was finished. That is to say, the Soviet Union attacked these islands after the Japanese announced their surrender. This United States-led occupation of Japan, possibly together with the fear of the atomic bomb, stopped any invasion of Hokkaido. Now today, looking back, not even today, I mean 20 years later, say in the 60s, it may have seemed extremely foolish to have granted so much to the Soviet Union from Japan for a war in which it had not fought, but this was part of the prevailing mood at the time. Churchill had been unable to protect Central Europe from falling to Stalin, and these remote parts of Japan must have seemed a very, very long way away. I mean, they may as well have been on the moon. Of course, we now know that the Soviet occupation of Korea led to a new war within 5 years. But what was thought of at the time was the cost of attacking the Japanese mainland. At the time, the United States military believed that such an invasion would cost 1 million US lives and around 20 million Japanese would die. Therefore, they were prepared to overlook future problems in order to resolve pressing military matters at that very time. We can see today that the failure to define exactly what the Allies meant at Cairo, Yalta and Potsdam was going to cause problems later, particularly in the case of the Kuril Islands, islands which Japan had not seized by violence and greed, to use the terms stated at Cairo. The Kurils also had a Japanese-speaking population. According to a US service book from 1943, the population of the Kuril Islands was just over 17,000 people in 1940, of which less than 400 were native Ainu. All of the Japanese population was deported to Japan in 1947. However, the islands, which Japan calls the Northern Territories, is even more difficult to define, as this country claimed that they were not part of the Kuril chain, and geographically one can see that they do not form part of the chain, even if many geographers have referred to them as being part of the Kurils. As early as the 27th of August 1945, President Harry Truman wrote to Stalin to say that the Kurils were Japanese territory and that they would be part of a peace treaty. The Soviet response was that Roosevelt had already assigned these islands to the Soviet Union once the war concluded. In 1951, the Treaty of San Francisco was signed between Japan and the Allied powers of World War II. By the time the Western Allies realized how they'd been duped into handing over much of Central Europe to the Soviet Union, and there was a war going on in Korea between the communist powers and the United Nations. The position of the Soviet Union was that promises made to it had to be stuck to, ignoring the blatant way it had disregarded its own promises. So it only works one way, same as it is today. However, Japan did agree to renounce its claims and its rights to the Kuril Islands and to that portion of Sakhalin and the islands adjacent to it, over which Japan had acquired sovereignty as a result of the Treaty of Portsmouth of the 5th of September 1905. The Soviet Union refused to sign the Treaty of San Francisco. So, it could be argued that they had no right to anything at all. As far as Japan is now concerned, at the time of the 1951 San Francisco Peace Conference, Japan held that the islands of Kunashiri, Etorufu, Shikotan and Habomai were technically not part of the Kuril Islands and thus were not covered by the provisions of the treaty. This view was disputed by the Soviet Union and continues to be disputed by Russia. In 1956, the Soviet Union proposed to settle the dispute by returning Shikotan and Habomai to Japan in exchange for a peace treaty. However, Japan, under US pressure, didn't agree. Both sides agreed to negotiate towards a final peace treaty, and this final peace treaty still hasn't happened. The position of the Russian government appears to be that Shikotan and the Habomai can be returned if Japan renounces its claims to the other islands. Indeed, offers for talks have come from the Russian side. However, Japan has first recognized Russia's right to these islands and then tried to negotiate them back. Nonetheless, nationalists on both sides are hardening their positions, making talks more difficult. Japan introduced school textbooks in July 2008 teaching that the Southern Kuril Islands are occupied territory, and organizations representing the descendants of those expelled from the Kuril Islands have a great deal of political sway. Given the increasing nationalism in Russia following the annexation of Crimea in 2014, any concessions to Japan will be unpopular with them. Furthermore, Russia has territorial disputes with many of its neighbours, and backing down could lead to more claims being made. I'd like to conclude this with a solution I came up with, but the solution dates to 2018. This is just my idea, because other than this, I couldn't see anything else happening. For me, the logical thing would be for Japan to accept the fait accompli of the USSR in 1945 and go along with the Russian offer to return Shikotan and the Habomai Islands and drop its claim to Kunashiri and Etorufu. That way, it would receive about 6% of the islands, together with any mineral, fishing, agriculture, and other wealth there. After all, 6% is better than nothing. However, the Russian position, I don't know how serious this offer to return it is, but the Russian position is that where the Russian soldier stands, that is Russia, irrespective of whatever country it may be in. And if you don't believe me, have a look at the Kremlin's own website, where this is written. I don't know if it's written in the English version, but it certainly is written it certainly is on the Russian language version. So I suggest you see that. Anyway, thanks very much for watching. So I wrote this long time ago, which just goes to show how long it takes me to actually upload anything. And I hadn't planned on doing this as a documentary, but now YouTube wants to see the face of the person. I don't know why, but it wants to see the face of the person, so that's why I'm in here. We do have a major problem on YouTube with AI slop, and this is making things very, very difficult, particularly as AI slop is the preferred means for YouTube. It could be, of course, that people want to watch AI slop rather than watch researched history, so in that case I can understand YouTube's point of view. But if you're interested in researched history, then this is the place to be. I'm uploading at least every Tuesday and every Friday with longer videos such as this, sometimes on other days as well, and on every other day I put at least a shorts video, shorts video being one of up to 3 minutes in length and in portrait format. I also have, should you be interested, members only service that costs £5, $6 a month. That gives you access now to over 800 members only videos, should you be interested. So thanks very much for being with me today. All the best and bye for now.